I want you to imagine that you have a dream. A dream to create the greatest animated film of all time. A film that you dedicate your entire life to seeing through. But you don't have any money, a studio, or even the ability to hire voice actors. So what do? Give up? Well, most of us would. But that's only because most of us aren't Richard Williams. Today I have for you what I might as well call the end of the line. I don't know how it gets any more insane than this. This movie broke me. And not the film itself, but rather the absolute madness that is this film's production, which is, by far and away, the longest production in film history. From the greatest and most unbelievable blunder in the history of film, to the funding of this project by a literal prince, the making of this film managed to reach literal fairy tale proportions. But what was this project? Why wasn't it ever finished? And how did the single greatest attempt in animation history to get away from the interference of big studios end up in the hands of the biggest studio in the world? Or in other words, what happened to The Thief and the Cobbler? Well, let's find out. Part 1. The production. By the way, if you don't care about the production and you just want to get to the portion of the video where I review and compare the films, I've time-stamped the video to allow you to do so. However, I strongly recommend that you stick around for this portion because, to put it mildly, it's insane. It all began with Richard Williams. Williams worked an odd coupling of jobs. His primary income came from directing live-action television commercials, but he also worked as an illustrator for a book series written by Idries Shah. After working together for many years, Williams asked Shah if he would be willing to work with him on a film adaptation of his book series. Shah agreed, but wanted 50% of all the profits from the film. Shah also put his dim-witted son Omar in charge of bookkeeping, which would later prove to be a pretty catastrophically bad idea, but we'll get to that in time. Williams saved as much as he could to fund the project, but with animation being such an incredibly expensive medium for filmmaking, progress was agonizingly slow. So slow, in fact, that the film didn't even have a working title until 4 years of pre-production. That's right. 4 years of pre-production. The working title for the project was The Amazing Nasrudin, based on the adventures of a real-life Turkish philosopher. Things started to look up for the production that same year as Williams had gotten enough money together to hire a veteran animator, Ken Harris, to work as his lead animator. Harris was known for his work on How the Grinch Stole Christmas and The Pink Panther, and so naturally you'd expect production to rapidly speed up. And it did, just not as well as anyone would have hoped. 2 years later, in 1970, the film's title was changed yet again to The Majestic Fool. By this time, Williams had made something of a name for himself in television after directing a successful adaptation of A Christmas Carol, and used the money to fund his film. Production was finally in full swing. Voice track recording began around the same time as Williams' TV special, and with the extra money he was able to hire Vincent Price, a longtime favorite of his, to voice one of the film's villains.
Quoth the raven, nevermore.
We'll leave the voice acting alone for now, but believe me, we'll get back to it. Oh yes, we'll get back to the absolute insanity of this film's voice acting, because there are some outright unbelievable facts about this film's voice cast. I feel it's important to note, by the way, that at this point, even with his notoriety as a semi-famous TV director, Williams' crew for this project was only 40. 40 people were working on this 2D animated film, and for reference, by the way, a Disney 2D animated film averages around 800 crew members, and that means Williams was working with a crew that was about 5% of the size of a major studio. In that same year, the film was renamed again to simply Nasrudin, and things really started to look up. The animation team had made significant progress on the film, and Paramount Pictures expressed interest in becoming the film's distributor. In 1972, 8 years after production began, Williams finally delivered. All that hard work had at long last paid off, and in fact it had more than paid off, because he'd managed to get a full 3 hours worth of animation completed. Or at least, that's the way it should have gone. If you know anything about this movie going in, you might be wondering a few things right now, like, for instance, I thought this movie was never completed in its original form, so how could there be 3 hours worth of animation if the movie never got finished? And you might also be wondering why the final cut of the movie is only 1 hour and 12 minutes, which is a mere 40% of the footage that was created. Well, there's no sensible way to put this, and I need to stress to you that this is real, I am not kidding, and there is no Poe's law applicable in this situation, okay? I will leave links to all the relevant information in case you don't believe me. So here's what happened. After the footage was complete, the film's composer, Howard Blake, came to Williams and told him that he wasn't sure how to score the movie because it didn't make any sense. Well, the reason that it didn't make any sense is because Williams had forgotten to write a story for the film before he had scenes animated. So what they had was a bunch of total nonsense with absolutely nothing tying it together and no semblance of a story whatsoever. Apparently, Blake told Williams, "The animation looks really good, but I think we should structure the footage into a 3-act story so it makes sense." Oh boy.
Okay, listen, the drawings are pretty good, but it doesn't make any sense, okay? It's fucking stupid, okay? What you need here is elevation, okay? There actually has to be something that happens that's actually funny. What the fuck is happening here?
But that's not all. For you see, this production was cursed. Horribly cursed to ensure that every single thing that could possibly go wrong for it would go wrong. You might remember how I mentioned earlier in this segment that the film was an adaptation of a book series created by Idris Shaw, and you might also remember that I mentioned that Shaw put his son Omar into a position as the film's bookkeeper. Well, around that same time that the footage was finished, Williams noticed that something was very, very wrong. He added up the expenses for the film himself and found that a considerable amount of money was unaccounted for. Because of this, he came to the conclusion that Omar embezzled much of the film's production money. This caused a huge falling out with Idris, and they decided to opt out of the film altogether. Now, I'm sure you can see why this was not a good thing for the future of the production. You see, the film was based on a property owned by Shaw, and so now that Williams no longer had his consent, they couldn't legally use any of his intellectual property. That means that any scene that contained one of the characters owned by Shaw couldn't be used in the film. That, of course, included the main character. So now, Williams was faced with the horrid situation of not being able to use almost anything he had created, and with Omar's alleged embezzlement, and the cost of the now useless footage, there was hardly any money left. To compound this disaster, Paramount Pictures withdrew their decision to distribute the film shortly after. With no footage, no distributor, close to no money, and no basis for their intellectual property, they were literally back at square one again. 8 years of production, and nothing to show for it. Now, after such a crippling blow to his production, you'd think that Williams would have had his ambitions sapped, but if anything, he only became more and more obsessed with seeing it finished. He claimed that it was his goal to create the greatest piece of animation of all time, and even called the project his reason for living. In 1973, Williams commissioned a new script for the film from Howard Blake, and the film was renamed to Tin Tack. In this treatment, the story revolved around a cobbler named Tack and an unnamed thief. Any scenes that didn't contain Nasruddin were reused and repurposed to keep the team from having to redo the entire film. By this time, Vincent Price had finished his voice recording, but there was still a huge gap in the voice acting department and they weren't making much progress with it. Even still, the production resumed as usual until yet another tragedy befell this endlessly cursed film. In 1974, the economic boom of the post-World War II era came to an end, after an oil embargo from Saudi Arabia caused a recession across the entire Western world. This already underfunded project now had to stretch their very few dollars even further. Williams was forced to use his new studio for TV commercials once again, and progress on the film stalled once more. Despite this, Williams was still extremely ambitious and tried his best to make the film as high quality as possible. One such attempt was animating the movie in ones, which, if you don't know, is basically animation slang for animating in 24 frames per second instead of the traditional 12 frames per second. Now, realizing that the film would never be finished unless more animators worked on it, Williams hired 6 veteran cartoonists to teach him how to animate the film himself. The film was renamed to The Thief around this same time. For the next 4 years, there was slow but steady progress, and there were no further disruptions to the production. And quite the opposite, actually, because in 1978, Mohammed bin Faisal Al Saud, the Prince of Saudi Arabia, heard about the project and liked it. Because he was so enthusiastic about the film, Faisal gave Williams $100,000 to create a 10-minute sequence for him to see if he wanted to fund the rest of the film. That's the equivalent of $435,000 today, by the way. Williams chose to animate the climactic final battle of the film, which is this scene I'm showing you right now. Faisal was very impressed with the result, but unfortunately, Williams had missed the set deadline for the finished product they'd agreed on, which is something that we'll see as sort of a theme with this production, and so Faisal decided not to fund the project any further. By 1986, Williams had finished only 20 minutes worth of film, which by this time he'd accepted simply couldn't be made without the money of big studios. He began showing the reel to several different producers, but was refused by almost all of them. But I'm happy to say that from here on out, things did start to look up for Williams, and I mean that, if only for a short time. He got his first huge break when he met Jake Eberts, chairman and founder of the Allied Films Company, who was so impressed with the animation style that he gave Williams $10 million to complete the project. Handing over control to Eberts, however, did have consequences. The script had to be rewritten almost entirely, editing out several characters and changing the movie's plot to the point where it was almost unrecognizable. The film was once again retitled, this time to Once. Now that he was rubbing elbows with some of the most powerful people in Hollywood, Williams managed to garner the attention of some huge names. One such person, a little-known guy named Steven Spielberg, loved Williams' design work so much that he asked him to direct his upcoming film, Who Framed Roger Rabbit. Williams agreed, and of course he managed to make a pretty huge name for himself in the process. The film was so successful that Williams ended up winning 2 Oscars for his work on it, which, if I'm not mistaken, makes him the only animator in history to have that achievement. But let me know in the comments if that's not true. With this credit under his belt, Williams finally had the clout in Hollywood to prove that he could not only deliver a project on time and within a budget, but that he could also make a film with widespread appeal. Both Spielberg and Disney promised to fund Williams' project, but they never followed through. Instead, Spielberg went on to become the founder of his own independent studio, Universal Pictures, and Disney decided to create their own animated films from scratch. However, Williams did manage to get a major studio involved to fund the film when he negotiated a deal with Warner Brothers for distribution in 1988. The deal included $25 million for the marketing of the film. In 1989, the film was retitled for the last time with Williams' involvement, and so became The Thief and The Cobbler. Finally, after 25 years, the film had enough money to go into full production. Full-color animation, chronological sequences, and a full voice cast. Warner Brothers knew that progress had been agonizingly slow on the production, and so they signed a contract with the Completion Bond Company, a sort of insurance policy for the completion of films to ensure that the movie would be finished on time. They gave Williams a 1991 deadline for the film. Of course, if you've been following along, you'll know that didn't happen. You see, the curse began to take full effect right about this time, despite all the incredible fortune that had shown on the film. But it came in a different form this time around. By this time, Williams had completely lost his mind. The animators were ground down to a bloody nub. The whole team worked 12 hours every single day to try and meet the deadline, and in spite of this, Williams was apparently an inconsolable mess. He would fly off the handle about everything, and he began firing people even for the slightest infractions. John Leatherbarrow, the cameraman for the film, stated, "He's fired hundreds of people. There's a list as long as your arm of people he's fired." John even said that Williams fired one animator as he was walking into work. He also hired bodyguards whenever he made public appearances to keep people from asking him about the film. To give the illusion that the film's production was further along than it actually was, he began sending reels of legally unusable footage from the Nasrudin era to the studio. When 1991 finally rolled around, Williams stated that he needed another 6 months to complete the movie. And it is now that our villain of the night makes his appearance. Suspicious that he was exaggerating, the completion bond company sent in one of their agents, producer Fred Calvert, to inspect the progress of the film. Fred didn't have a very good reputation, to say the least. He was seen as sort of a huckster who had no love for animation, and on top of that, he was apparently known to frequently churn out cheap crap for a quick dollar. Calvert was apparently horrified at what he saw. Apparently the film was nowhere near completion, and the budget had already been entirely depleted. Williams was forced to show the executives and financial backers of the film what footage he had completed, and they weren't pleased, to say the least. What they were shown was a hodgepodge, thrown-together mess that had only a beginning, some odd images tossed together in the middle, and 10 minutes of footage for the ending that had been funded by Faisal years previous. It was at this time that everything fell apart entirely. Eberts of Allied Filmmakers backed out of the project entirely, and Warner Brothers followed suit almost immediately after. The completion bond company now had full legal control over the film, and Williams was fired. After 28 years of production, the film was left unfinished. And so there we have it. The most insane story of any production that I have ever seen. The footage that was shown to the Warner Brothers executives is what I'll be calling the original, because there's no true definitive version of Williams' work. Since so much of the film was altered and mixed together with other versions, along with tons of footage that was just lost entirely, I'm afraid this is as close as we can get. Lest you think the production of this film is over, by the way, stay seated because it only gets crazier still from here. I mean, after all, we've still got to go through the Disney version and see just how that came about. But with all that established, let us get on to the review of the actual film. Part 2, the original cut. Okay, so already before we even begin, we come to an impasse, because there's two different versions of this film that are considered to be the original cut. There's the restored version, called the Recobbled Edition, where scenes from the work print were reanimated to be fully completed. They also added in scenes that were missing from the original, and cleaned up the color palette to make it pop more. This version was created by fans of the film who wanted to see Williams' vision through. This, however, is not the original cut of the film. Despite the fact that it has been almost universally accepted as the original cut of this movie, this is not the film made by Richard Williams. And don't let them fool you, I'm not kidding. This is almost to the point of like a conspiracy, how widely accepted it is that this is the original cut of this movie. It is not. Even Wikipedia will tell you that this is the original cut of The Thief and the Cobbler, but that is not true. Richard Williams did not make this version of the movie. Garrett Gilchrist, a fan of Williams' work, made this version of the movie. Instead, we'll be taking a look at the actual original cut of the movie, the work print that was shown to the producers. The reason for this is that, whereas Gilchrist's work is absolutely amazing, and in my opinion his version is actually a lot better, Richard Williams did not direct it, animate it, or otherwise have any involvement with it. And so, instead we will look at the version that Williams himself made. The Thief and the Cobbler is one of the most bizarre and strange movies ever made. There's really no other way to put it. Everything about this movie is unconventional in the extreme. First of all, the landscape itself is incredibly odd. This movie takes place in a world where logic simply does not apply whatsoever. Physics? What are physics? Get them out of here. Almost every single shot in this movie is some bizarre optical illusion, and so at times it's difficult to even understand what you're looking at. On top of that, we've got a protagonist who doesn't talk.
I love you.
You see that? That's the only time he talks in the whole movie. Same with the thief, only more extreme, as the thief doesn't talk at all. And in the unconventional department, it's filled to the brim with adult themes. There's tons of references to sex, and this movie has a grand total of over 1,000 on-screen deaths. So with all that in mind, you're probably thinking that this movie is a big load of crap, right? Well, you'd be wrong, because this movie's great, and I love it. It's got some problems, and believe me, we'll talk about the problems. But for now, let's just take a good look at what Richard Williams has made for us. The Thief and the Cobbler takes place in a world where there's a magical golden city protected by 3 golden balls. It was prophesied by mystics that if the golden balls were ever removed from the city, then it would fall into ruin. In the beginning of the movie, we're introduced to the thief. The thief attempts to rob Tack, the cobbler who's sleeping, and accidentally causes him to trip and fall down the stairs. We are then introduced to the best part, by far, of this entire movie. Zigzag the Grand Vizier, voiced by Vincent Price, arrives at the city with his epic entourage of weird-looking ghouls. And if this isn't the most amazing entrance of a villain ever, then I don't know what is. Zigzag is the best thing in the world. I love this character. I can't even express to you how much I love this character. Now, I'm sure you're a little skeptical about whether or not he's actually the greatest character of all time, but put that to rest. Because he is, and I'll prove it to you.
O greatest king of all the earth, this low-born cobbler of no worth attacked me in the square today. Shall we take his head away?
So there you have it. He speaks in rhymes. Every single line of dialogue from this character is a rhyme. And it's amazing. Now, we'll delve more into the characters later, but for now I'll finish up with our plot summary. After falling down the stairs, a thumbtack from Tack's overalls spills out onto the road. Zigzag steps on it and orders Tack to be arrested. At the palace, Tack meets King Nod and quickly falls in love with his daughter, Princess Yum Yum. Zigzag wants to have Tack executed, but Yum Yum breaks her shoe on purpose so that Tack can fix it, saving his life. A comically wounded soldier returns to the city and warns King Nod that the One-Eyes, a group of barbaric conquerors, have killed all of his guards outside the city and will attack soon. The thief manages to steal the golden balls from their tower, but Zigzag steals them back. After a very unsuccessful attempt to make Princess Yum Yum fall in love with him, Zigzag decides to take the golden balls to King One-Eye instead to have the city destroyed as revenge.
You want my daughter? Never!
Never.
Never! Ever! Get out! Out!
Well, I just thought I'd ask.
When the One-Eyes attack the city, Tack throws a thumbtack that causes a chain reaction that destroys the entire One-Eye army. Zigzag tries to run away, but falls into a pit where he's eaten by alligators. And in the end, Tack marries Yum Yum, and everybody lives happily ever after. So there's a lot I have to say about this movie, but we'll begin by talking about the positives. What I think was the most important aspect of this film, and what's also given the film its cult following, is the fact that they were willing to make it so wonderfully exaggerated and over the top. Everything in this movie is turned up to 11. Case in point, you have a character who goes to inform the king about the One-Eyes, and you need to show that he's wounded. So what do? Have an arrow sticking out of his back? How about we have 30 arrows and a flag sticking out of his back instead? Same with King One-Eye himself. You want to show that this guy is aggressive and cruel? Have his entire mouth be nothing but endless rows of teeth. Everything in this movie follows this pattern. The One-Eye's war machine, Zigzag's insane design, and even the doors of the palace. I think that one of the greatest examples of this is the fact that King One-Eye sits on a throne made of actual people. And this exaggeration helps make the movie elevated above what's already an extremely exaggerated medium for film. Fun fact about the character design in this movie, by the way, almost every single character was modeled after someone who worked on it. The witch was modeled after Grim Natwick, one of the animators who taught Richard Williams how to animate. The thief was made to look like Ken Harris, the chief animator. And you remember Omar, the guy Williams accused of embezzling funds for the movie? Well, he has a character modeled after him as well. Zigzag. A character who's a conniving charlatan who tries to destroy a perfect thing by taking something that doesn't belong to him. I think that Williams was a bit sour about the whole affair. The score to this movie is also really, really good. It feels almost dreamlike in its ability to sound familiar, but yet sort of ethereal at the same time. I'm also a big fan of the One Eyes theme because it contrasts so aggressively with the rest of the score to show how the One Eyes are so different from anyone else in the film. The general feel of this movie is so completely different from anything you'll see in any other movie. It honestly doesn't even seem like something so odd could even exist. But in the best kind of way. It's completely and utterly unique in the extreme, but hands down the most impressive thing about this movie is the absolutely breathtaking, creative, innovative, and flawlessly fluid animation sequences. There are some scenes in this movie that honestly shocked me with just how incredibly smooth they are. You might have noticed a theme here with the positives, and so I might as well come out and say it. The villains of this film totally steal the show. This film's bad guys are pretty much the best part of it. I love how they were able to have such a sharp and immediate contrast between the two of them. Zigzag is a fast-talking, wide-eyed, skinny, clever bad guy, whereas King One-Eye, on the other hand, is a slow, half-lidded, bulky dimwit. They achieve this contrast really well, I think, by making them opposites of the color wheel. Zigzag has cool colors, mainly blue, purple, and green, whereas King One-Eye has warm colors like red and orange. But all of this is dressing for what we know is the real best part of this film, and that's the fact that, once again, Zigzag is the best character in the world.
Mighty One Eye! I am Zigzag, the great of the Golden Land.
But there are some negatives. I think that one of the things that really brings this movie down is the fact that it really drags toward the middle. There's a lot of stuff in this already short movie that doesn't need to be there. And of course, the movie is not finished. There are scenes that are missing for context. There's whole sections of the film that are either half animated in color or are just a slideshow of black and white pencil drawings. And to be honest with you, there is some merit to the perception that it just doesn't make a lot of sense. You do get the sense that this is a film cobbled together out of unrelated pieces. The biggest flaw in this entire film to me, however, has nothing to do with that. Instead, it has everything to do with the fact that the thief, the titular character of this movie, has absolutely no reason to be in it. Sure, he does steal the golden balls, and he causes Tack to get arrested, but there's really nothing that he does in this film that couldn't have been done without him. And that's a major, major problem to me because of how much screen time he has versus what he actually does in the movie. There's one last thing that I want to say about this film, however, before we move on. You remember how I mentioned earlier that the voice acting on this film was insane? Well, here's a couple of examples of that. First of all, Tack's one single line in this movie was supposed to be recorded by Sean It's Totally Cool to Hit Women Connery, but he never showed up to set. Second of all, and here's a fun bit of mystery for you, nobody actually knows whose voice this is.
I love you.
This person was uncredited, and there is no source anywhere on the internet that could tell me who this is that voices him. I just thought that was kind of a fun bit of trivia. Also, there's a scene in this movie where a crowd is arguing, and the actual voice lines, well, they defy belief. You see, Richard Williams hired a bunch of Irish guys and gave them beer and told them to get drunk, and then he recorded their conversation. At one point during the conversation, the men started arguing and actually got into a fight, and he left it in the movie. I am not kidding you. He left it in the movie. And here's the best part. There are 4 versions of this movie, and that voice clip is in every single one of them. Here's a video of that. But it doesn't stop there. The original voice of King One-Eye, Paul Matthews, was not a voice actor. He was a delivery man who Williams met in an elevator and asked him if he wanted to be in his movie. And even though Paul is credited as the voice in the film, however, they apparently didn't use his voice in the movie and instead hired Christopher Greener instead, although it's impossible to tell which one of these is correct because there's conflicting reports about who plays this character in what draft. You can't make this stuff up, folks. But to me, the weirdest decision out of all of these in regards to the voice acting is the fact that Williams cast Donald Pleasance, famous for playing the greatest supervillain ever, as Zigzag's pet bird, Fido. And this is not a Jafar Iago situation here. Like, Fido doesn't talk. He just makes bird noises. So it's really, really odd that they cast such a famous actor for such a bizarre role. Now, I'll save my final thoughts on the work print for the end of the video, where we'll compare all the versions of this film, but for now, we'll just have to press on. Part 3. The Fred Calvert Cut. Before we can get to the Disney cut, which is what I'm sure everybody here wants to see, we have to pick up where we left off with our production and our villain, as it were. Where we last left off, Warner Brothers had abandoned the project and the Completion Bond Company had fired Williams from the project. Sue Shakespeare of Creative Capers Entertainment tried in vain to get Williams back as the director of the film, but it would never happen. Instead, Fred Calvert took full control of the movie. The film was renamed again to The Princess and the Cobbler, with plans to completely overhaul it. An entirely new voice cast was hired, and an animation team was brought in to finish the parts of the work print that were still only partially complete. If you want to see the quote that should be cited under the very definition of a red flag, just read this quote from Fred Calvert about his involvement with the movie. "I'm sure you can tell that things didn't go well. Fred didn't think much of animation to begin with, and his reputation as a sleazy anything-for-money guy made the team very, very reluctant to work with him. But even still, Fred delivered on a finished product. It took 18 months for the film to be completed, and it was released in 1993, 2 years after Williams was fired from the project. So how did it turn out? Was all that extra money and time worth it? Was Fred Calvert's reputation really true to his character? Well, let's take a look. There's a number of changes from the original film, so let's take it step by step. First of all, 18 minutes of footage were cut from the film for being repetitive, and I have to agree that a lot of the scenes from the original were indeed repetitive, so that was probably a good call. In some ways, however, not always, there were a lot of weird things that probably shouldn't have been cut, but we'll get to that. Like, I think cutting out the references to the prostitute from the work print, and yes, that's a real scene from the first movie, that was probably a good call. About half of the changes are okay. I mean, introducing the one-eyes in the beginning of the movie, cutting down the pointless scenes of the thief just walking around, and brightening the color palette were all good decisions. My favorite change to this film is the way more satisfying death of King One-Eye. In the first movie, after he's defeated, the women he's enslaved sit on him similar to how he sat on them earlier in the movie. But this version does it better, I think. Instead, the slaves yell "thrown" at him over and over again, just like he did, and then throw him off the machine to his death. It's very cathartic, and I prefer this. But then there's some weird decisions in there too, like, for example, why did they make it so that the thief becomes a good guy at the end? I don't get that at all. It's not a redemption arc either. He just, at the literal very last scene of the entire movie, gives up and returns the golden balls to the king, and then everybody likes him. One of the really, really bad changes to this film is what they did to Tack, however. Tack narrates the opening, telling us all about the story and who he is, and I hate it. Tack talks in this movie, and I had to watch a version of the movie where he does to appreciate the version where he does not.
Now, what this thief thought he was going to find in my shop, I will never know.
You see, I like having Tack as a mute character because it forces you to characterize him with just expressions and movement. And that's a fun and different way to go about creating a protagonist. Oh, and I hope you like listening to this guy, because not only does he have normal dialogue in the film, he also narrates everything.
Everything.
The king could sleep anytime he wanted, so he did. Everyone called him King Nod.
I guess they thought that my human eyes and ears were incapable of understanding the premise of cause and effect, so they decided to have someone explain to me what's going on through the entire movie. Like you would to a baby. That's nowhere near the worst thing about this movie, though. Oh no, it doesn't get better, it only gets worse. Okay, so they recast almost everyone in this movie, like I said, and the replacements are so much worse that I have no idea how they thought that this was an improvement.
Oh my God, my daughter!
The most jarring thing about this movie, in my view, was the fact that they turned it into a musical. Now, don't get me wrong, I love musicals. In fact, I'd say almost every story is elevated by making it into a musical instead of just an ordinary musicless film. But there's some obvious problems here. First of all, this is based on a work print that was not a musical, meaning they had to go back and revise entire scenes to make it fit into the movie. It's also very odd that there's only 4 songs in this movie, and that's about half the number that most musicals have. The biggest problem, however, with this being a musical, is that the music is ungodly boring. It's not awful, I won't say that. It's just incredibly boring.
Outwardly she's free, inwardly she's bound.
There's barely any change in the songs from start to finish, and it's not really all that interested in furthering the plot, so it feels like a stop sign every time one of these songs appears in the movie. We just grind to a halt, and they're not short either. Every one of these songs is like 3 or 4 minutes long. But there is a greater sin with regards to the soundtrack of this movie. Howard Blake's amazing score for the first film is entirely cut from this one. In fact, they only kept one of his songs from the entire score. I suppose it would have been okay if the new score was better, but it's not. The worst offense here is the removal of Zigzag's entry song, which is easily my favorite piece of music from the original film. Also, it makes the scene where he meets King One-Eye a lot more bizarre when there's this poppy, upbeat music playing in the background. In the original version, you can hear war drums beating in the background instead, and it fits the scene way better. The film didn't do so well at the box office, making only $319,000 on a $24 million budget, and it received very poor reviews. As I said, I'll save my final thoughts and ranking of these movies until the very end, so for now, let's move on to the version you've all been waiting for. Part 4. The Disney Cut. In December of 1994, Miramax, then a subsidiary of Disney, bought the rights to the movie. Less than a year later, they had a finished version ready to release. For a glimpse at the quality we're in for, look no further than Jake Ebert's review. Do you remember him? The first producer to back the project? Well, in his own words, this version of the movie is superior to the original, so let's see if that's right. Okay, so first of all, they renamed the movie again. This time it's called Arabian Nights. Second of all, every single change from the Calvert Cut is present in this movie. So everything I don't like about that movie applies to this one too. Now, I will begin with the positives, and there's not many of them. They recast almost everyone in this movie again, and that's not an entirely good thing, believe me, we'll talk about that. But I do like this movie's version of Yum Yum's voice better than the previous versions. Jennifer Beals gives her a little more personality and energy to her character, and I appreciate that.
It just so happens, Daddy, I need a cobbler.
What?
Okay, that's it. That's all the positives. Now let's get to the negatives. There were some absolutely abysmal decisions made with regards to the voice recasting for this version of the movie. Disney got a bunch of A-list actors to be in this movie, including Matthew Broderick and Jonathan Winters. Now, here's the thing. I like Matthew Broderick, but his voice does not fit this character at all. I mean, it's still better than the voice from The Princess and the Cobbler, but that's not a high bar. and he still feels the need to explain everything in this movie to me.
But the evil King One-Eye had overlooked one fearless scout.
I guess this was their way around the confusing and nonsensical script to the original, just have Tack explain everything that's happening all the time. But there's way worse stuff going on with this movie's casting. The thief talks now, and he's voiced by Jonathan Winters. Okay, so here's the thing. I like Jonathan Winters too, but let me tell you what I don't like. They couldn't give the character dialogue that involved other characters because he almost never interacts with any other characters. So instead what they did was have the thief also narrate everything that's happening in the movie.
Now it's time to get to work.
And then, of course, because we have to give every mute character in this story a voice, Fido, the bird, also talks now. Not to anybody else, mind you. Oh no, he's just also narrating everything that's going on in the movie. And you might remember that the character Fido from the original script was abused and mistreated by Zigzag, and his main goal was just to get some food. Well, they showed us that Fido was hungry by giving him a swollen belly and making him gesture toward his mouth constantly. In this movie, he just tells you that he's hungry all the time.
Is this when we eat? I need to eat. I don't see any food. I'm still hungry here.
And when I said every mute character in this movie has to have dialogue, I wasn't kidding. I mean, even the alligators that eat Zigzag have to talk now. There were also some very odd choices made with regards to what they censored versus what they didn't censor. For example, Miramax censored this scene from the movie entirely of King One-Eye's dancing girls, and of course they censored the scene with the prostitute from the original version. But here's a few interesting facts about this particular censorship that I find especially bizarre. So obviously I'm not opposed to excluding sexually explicit content from movies targeting children, and maybe I'm just too much of a square, but most of the time I'm probably going to be on the studio sides with regards to censoring overtly adult scenes and media intended for kids. But the weird thing about this scene with One-Eye's dancing girls is that it's really not sexual. And it also cuts one of the best pieces of animation from the movie. But here's another weird thing that boggles the mind. So they cut this scene from the movie, but they left this one in.
What's that? Oh, a naked lady.
Plus, because nothing in this movie can exist without its own rabbit hole, do you know who it was that made the decision to cut this scene from the film for fear of it being too sexual for a cartoon? Harvey Weinstein. I'm not kidding. Some other censorship of the movie is also very odd. They cut the character of the witch out of the movie almost entirely, and so one of the only bits of exposition is completely missing. They did this supposedly because of drug references in the scene, so whatever, but here's yet another incredibly and inexplicably strange choice that was made. So they all but cut the character out of the movie entirely, but then they also decided to make her the sister of King One-Eye. And this serves no purpose whatsoever. It's just as out of the blue as you would expect it to be. There are a few other changes that make very little sense. They cut King One-Eye's death out of the movie. They cut the final battle sequence and made it pitifully short. And they call the city Baghdad now. I'm not sure why, but ultimately that's it. Part 5. The conclusion. Okay, so now it's time for my final thoughts on all 4 of these films, from the original to the recobbled edition. Now, before we get into this, I just have to say that if you want the best version of this movie, watch the Gilchrist recobbled version. He did an amazing and commendable job making this into a real movie, and he deserves the recognition for all that hard work. But now on to the conclusion. So at the beginning of this video, as is customary for all of the videos in this series, I made you a promise to tell you what happened to the Thief and the Cobbler, so let's get to it. I think that the original version was something to be commended. Richard Williams wanted to create something that was different in every way. Something that subverted expectation in a way that no one had ever seen before. And I like his moxie. I really admire that Richard Williams put so much time and effort and passion into this project. He spent nearly 30 years of his life trying to bring this film to life. And it is true that in many ways, the other versions of this film ruined that vision. They made it more commercial, more conventional, and more palatable. But and here's where I think I might lose some of you, but hear me out. This addition to What Happened To proves, at least to me, that third time is a charm indeed. Because you see, usually in this series I come away with the conclusion that the studios are the bad guys and the little guy, the original version, is the good guy. That's not the case here, and I'll explain. You see, Richard Williams was not the victim in this story. You know how I called Fred Calvert the villain of this story throughout the video? Well, that's only because that's the framing he's been boxed into. It is my opinion that Richard Williams himself is the true villain of this story, and I do not view Fred Calvert or Disney as the bad guys. I mean, try to look at this situation through the eyes of the producers for a second. You're working with a man, Richard Williams, who has not only repeatedly failed to meet deadlines for the project you've paid him millions of dollars for, but has also outright lied to you multiple times. He sends you fake footage of a movie that doesn't even exist to try to fool you into thinking he's closer to being done than he actually is, and he's completely irascible on set. On top of all this, Williams was clearly showing signs of mental decline and was outright abusive toward his staff, working them unethical hours and creating an extremely toxic and horrid work environment for them where they were put on the chopping block at all times. And after all that, after every opportunity they gave him, every second, third, fourth, and fifth chance, what did he do? He turned in a woefully incomplete film that didn't make any sense and was months past its deadline. Now, be reasonable and tell me that you would have kept this guy on your payroll after that. I think that people accept this narrative of Williams as an independent and brilliant filmmaker with a heart of gold, who was mistreated by the big mean studio because it makes for a better story. There's something very unsatisfying about the truth that he was an incompetent, abusive, deceitful control freak who was fired because he was an unstable lunatic. And here's the thing. Fred Calvert proved to be exactly what everybody said he was. Yes, absolutely, but you know what? He did his job. He didn't do it well, and believe me, I have no love for this man, but he didn't lie to the studio, and he didn't pretend to be anything other than exactly what he was. Ultimately, I view this story as a tragedy. Someone dedicated so much of their life to something only to have it stripped away at the last second. But I think the real tragedy of this story is in the fact that sometimes the undoing is our own fault, no matter how much we refuse to admit it. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. Like the video if you liked it, or dislike the video if you didn't like it, and subscribe for more. That's all for now.